Canadians have experienced unforgettable emergencies and significant disasters, which are occurring with greater frequency and increased damages and financial losses. A disaster is the result of a natural or man-made hazards interacting with social vulnerabilities, including marginalization and unequal access to resources, assistance, and knowledge. So, disasters affect different segments of society in different ways. Policy decisions related to land use, livelihoods, and environmental management can increase vulnerabilities and the risk of a disaster, but they can also reduce them. Disasters can be mitigated or even prevented. They are not inevitable. December 6, 1917. While carrying munitions bound for the battlefields in France, the SS Imo and SS Mont Blanc collided in the Halifax harbor. The collision generated the largest human-made explosion prior to the atomic era. 9,000 people were injured, 2,000 perished. 1918 to 1920. The influenza pandemic began during the First World War. As soldiers returned home, 1/3 of the world's population became infected. The pandemic caused social and economic disruption across the globe. More than 50,000 people in Canada died. June 23, 1946. A magnitude 7.3 earthquake struck Vancouver Island. Shaking was felt through the Pacific Northwest. The earthquake caused structural damage and landslides, and 2 deaths. It remains the largest onshore earthquake in Canadian history. April 15th to June 12th, 1950. Snow melt and heavy rain caused devastating flooding in Winnipeg and the Red River Valley. 100,000 residents evacuated their homes with the assistance of the Canadian Armed Forces. At the time, it was the largest evacuation in Canada. Approximately 10,000 homes were destroyed. What followed was the construction of the Red River Floodway, which was intended to prevent future flooding in Winnipeg. April 15th to 18th, 1954. After battering Haiti and the Carolinas, Hurricane Hazel struck the Toronto area as an extratropical storm. Rain caused rivers to swell and submerged transportation routes. 81 people died, and 4,000 families were left houseless. As a result, comprehensive flood control measures were enacted. October 23, 1958. An underground seismic event known as a bump in the No. 2 coal mine in Spring Hill, Nova Scotia, collapsed mine shafts. 75 miners were killed in the event, and 99 were rescued. October 16, 1970. At the request of Premier Robert Bourassa and the Municipality of Montreal, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act during peacetime.
Just watch me.
The Canadian Armed Forces were deployed in response to a series of attacks and notable kidnappings perpetrated by the Front Libération du Québec. Invoking the War Measures Act allowed the suspension of civilian liberties and authorized arrests and detentions without charge. November 10, 1979. A 106-car CP rail freight train derailed in Mississauga, Ontario. Tankers carrying chemicals and explosives ruptured, resulting in a massive explosion. Due to the possible threat of chlorine gas, 200,000 people evacuated. It was the largest peacetime evacuation in North America until Hurricane Katrina in 2005. May 16, 1986. Spring flooding caused severe damage to housing and infrastructure, sweeping away much of Weenusk First Nation. The community was temporarily hosted by Attawapiskat First Nation and permanently relocated upriver that same year. July 31st, 1987. An F4 tornado pummeled eastern Edmonton and Strathcona County. The tornado destroyed residential and industrial areas, killing 27 people, injuring hundreds, and leaving 1,700 homeless. In its aftermath, Alberta developed a warning system and formed the Alberta Emergency Management Agency. July 19th to 20th, 1996. After weeks of heavy precipitation, flash floods hit the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean region of Quebec. 16,000 people were evacuated, and hundreds of homes were damaged or destroyed. 10 people died due to the flooding and mudslides. A commission reported that dams and dikes in the region were inadequate and poorly maintained. April and May 1997. Just a handful of months later, the flood of the century inundated communities along the Red River, including the Red River Valley of Manitoba, North Dakota, and Minnesota. More than 25,000 people evacuated in Manitoba. An emergency dike was constructed to protect the city of Winnipeg. The emergency response, supported by the Canadian Armed Forces and volunteers, was one of the largest during peacetime in Canadian history. January 4th to 10th, 1998. More than 100 millimeters of ice pellets and freezing rain fell on eastern Ontario and southern Quebec. The ice storm collapsed electrical infrastructure and left millions without power. 35 people died, hundreds were injured, and hundreds of thousands were temporarily displaced. Impacted provinces received help from the Canadian Armed Forces, the largest domestic deployment in history. It was also the CAF's largest operational deployment since the Korean War. Late February 2002. Amid a global outbreak, severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS, arrived in Canada. The virus strained public health and healthcare system capacities. Thousands of people were quarantined, and 44 people died. Late September 2003. Hurricane Juan made landfall in Nova Scotia as a Category 2 storm. It produced high winds, sheets of rain, and storm surges. Damage included widespread uprooting of trees, power outages, and property damage, and 8 deaths. August 19th, 2005. Multiple severe storms occurred between Kitchener and Oshawa, Ontario. As a result, 2 F2 tornadoes tore through power lines, trees, structures, and vehicles in Perth and Wellington counties. Torrential rains caused flash flooding in the Greater Toronto Area, and firefighters rescued 4 people who fell in the Don River. 2011. In the spring, flooding in Manitoba resulted in damage to homes and infrastructure and the evacuation of 18 First Nations. Lake St. Martin First Nation had to be rebuilt in a new location and at a higher elevation. Community members lived in hotels and temporary accommodations while they waited. That summer, 4,216 wildfires burned in Canada. Residents of 35 First Nations evacuated to other First Nations, towns, and cities due to wildfires and smoke. June 19th to 28th, 2013. A large storm system caused significant flooding, starting in northern Alberta and moving south. Flooding disrupted power, telecommunications, water supply, and transportation across the province. The Bow and Elbow rivers swelled and flooded thousands of buildings and businesses, forcing evacuations. Eye River and Canmore were also seriously impacted. In total, 100,000 Albertans were forced to evacuate, and the floods caused 4 deaths. April 30th to June 1st, 2016. A system of wildfires swept through the regional municipality of Wood Buffalo and the city of Fort McMurray. In early May, the Fort McMurray wildfire grew and cut off evacuation routes. Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation and Fort McMurray implemented mandatory evacuation orders. The Alberta government also declared a provincial state of emergency. The fire spread quickly and passed through Fort McMurray. As they grew, oil sand operations north of the area were halted. Over 90,000 people were evacuated, and thousands of homes and businesses were destroyed. July 7th to September 15th, 2017. In early July, record-breaking heat and dry weather descended on Western Canada. In early July, roughly 200 fires started in British Columbia. On July 7th, the province declared a state of emergency that lasted 70 days. 4,700 firefighting personnel worked tirelessly across the province, including 1,200 personnel from other provinces and abroad. The Canadian Armed Forces supported firefighting operations, evacuations, and transportation, and delivery of aid. 23 First Nations communities were impacted, and the city of Williams Lake evacuated. By the end of the season, a record 1,338 fires had burned. April and May 2019. Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick experienced extensive flooding due to heavy rain and snowmelt. More than a dozen states of emergency were declared in communities along the Ottawa River and its tributaries. Thousands of people evacuated as homes flooded. 2,500 Canadian Forces personnel deployed as part of Operation Lentus. CAF personnel assisted with 1.5 million sandbags, wellness checks, route clearing, transportation, and evacuations. On March 11, 2020, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a worldwide pandemic. In the following years, world populations endured millions of cases and millions of deaths. The pandemic was challenging for all of Canada, but at-risk populations, including people living in Indigenous communities, long-term care facilities, and other congregate settings, faced dangerous outbreaks due to difficulties controlling the spread of the virus. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Canadian Armed Forces assisted authorities across Canada with preventative healthcare measures and responded to the needs of at-risk communities through Operation Laser. Spring 2021. As part of the COVID-19 response, the Canadian Armed Forces assisted with planning, training, logistics, and transportation of equipment required for the mass vaccine distribution campaign through Operation Vector. As June came to an end, heat and dry weather intensified in northwestern Ontario. Record-breaking wildfires threatened First Nations and the town of Red Lake. Approximately 3,400 people evacuated from 6 First Nations. Manitoba also faced high heat, low precipitation, and extreme wildfires in July. More than 1,000 people from 4 First Nations evacuated to Winnipeg. November 2021. Months after a heat dome and a record wildfire season, a weather system called an atmospheric river washed away roads and infrastructure in British Columbia. Homes and farmland also flooded. The city of Vancouver was even temporarily cut off by road from the rest of Canada. The province of British Columbia declared a state of emergency. The Canadian Armed Forces helped the province by supporting food and equipment delivery, sandbagging, damage assessment, evacuations, and transportation of staff. More than 3,300 people were displaced, and 5 died. September 24th, 2022. After impacting Guadeloupe, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and Turks and Caicos, Hurricane Fiona made landfall as a post-tropical cyclone in Nova Scotia. The storm uprooted thousands of trees and caused severe flooding in parts of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, and Quebec. 80% of Nova Scotia and 95% of Prince Edward Island lost power. Many homes and 2 people were swept into the ocean. It was the costliest and most intense post-tropical cyclone to hit Canada thus far.